David, did you ever get the squirt bottle treatment?
From Mr. Green.
Yeah.
I did. Yes, I got it once.
Okay, so Cameron, we had our high school history teacher. There were two things. He loved history, and he hated the movie The Patriot. And if you ever insinuated that the Patriot was a good movie, he'd pull out the squirt bottle from his cabinet and spray you. And
Is that legal?
it's whatever. It was just water. It's not gonna hurt you.
And also the way he did it, like he wasn't like fuming and angry. Like he was like laughing, and everyone else would laugh along as he.
But then
did
they
it.
probably say the Patriot, like they probably say it many times just to get squirted by him.
That's actually how I got squirted. Like I remember someone brought it up in passing, and then I like looked to Mr. Green just to be a little dipshit, and I was like, "Patriot, man, great movie, the best." And he came over and squirted me.
It's actually because of him that I started taking history a little more seriously, and it became something that was important to me. And so that's why I can trace my origin story, my Wayne family getting shot in the alley from that moment, the squirt bottle incident.
Are you saying Mr. Green shot your parents?
Well, I really should have thought of a better metaphor for that.
He used actual guns this time. Yeah, he used actual bullets.
Hopefully he's enjoying his retirement.
Hopefully.
Well, the thing is, I remember like when I told you about the History of Rome podcast, and then you texted me like in November. It's like, this is a history podcast, and I was like, I'm down. Being in music and journalism, like I never like exercised my historical acumen, so this is like the first time like I'm really ever using my history knowledge to like a different on like a expressive platform, other than writing papers for professors who would call me out on my syntax.
But now we're speaking, baby. Don't gotta worry about your written syntax.
Don't gotta worry about writing it.
I'm super excited. Boys, you want to get started?
Let's get started.
Let's do it.
All right. Welcome to the first official episode of A Mouthful of History. I am your host for the day, Nicholas Malott. I am a recent graduate from Cal State Fullerton. My degree was in film, but my minor was in history, and I've actually been studying history going back to high school. I've always had a really big interest in it. However, if you're looking for a little more credentialed guys, to my immediate is David Hollingsworth. Now, David Hollingsworth is he has a master's in modern U.S. and Latin American history, and currently works as a teaching assistant for a world history writing program at UCSD. How you doing, David?
I'm doing pretty good, man. Glad to be here.
All right. Right across from me is Cameron Millage. Cameron is a recorded musician, a journalist for LA Soccer Nation, and currently a student teacher teaching 10th grade world history. Cameron, how you doing?
Doing well. How about you?
Oh, I'm doing great. So, yeah, all three of us are we've known each other for a while, and big history. We like talking history. We like talking a lot of topics, but history seems to be the one that seems to unite us all together to a degree, if not politics, which actually this episode has a good cross between the both of them.
Yeah, I mean, I think politics in a lot of ways and history are inseparable, because when you're studying history, one of the main things you are studying is different ways in which we've conceptualized how to, lead each other and how to distribute resources and power. So when you're looking at those patterns throughout history, I mean, you can't really separate the two of them.
I mean, politics is history. You look at it, because all legislation's built on each other throughout history of like years and years of legislation. So it's like it's building on the history of former acts, former laws. They're inextricably linked. That's the beauty about it.
Yeah. We were trying to think of what would make a great first episode, and obviously we're on the cusp of the start of the Democratic primary process, and we have a presidential election this year, and there is so much to be taken from the history of U.S. presidential elections. It is crazy how the election of a person can change the course of history. So what we're going to talk about today is elections. Elections are majorly important. They, without hyperbole, do dictate the direction of the country, especially when you have landslide victories, like at least two of you are going to be talking about today.
That's right.
Oh, yeah.
And what the consequences of that is, both in the moment and in the immediate aftermath. The election I chose today is the election of 1800. That is famously the second election, actually, between Thomas Jefferson and incumbent President John Adams. Now, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, they were, of course, part of the Continental Congress. A lot of people like to give Thomas Jefferson sole credit for the Declaration of Independence. That's not true. They were both part of the group that drafted the Declaration of Independence.
They were also both members of Animal House. Little known fact.
They had differing opinions on a lot of things, but they were brothers in arms basically together in the revolutionary cause. Once we got to realize that the Articles of Confederation just was not a good system of setting up a federal government, we of course we had the the Congressional Congress that helped draft the Constitution. Jefferson, being a states' rights advocate, was not really in favor of the Constitution. He didn't think it was necessary. John Adams was a very strong supporter of a strong centralized government. Basically, the same argument we're having now. It never went away.
It's just always kept
Well,
going.
didn't Jefferson say that the Constitution should like update every 20 years?
Yes.
Too. Like,
yeah, he thought it should be ever changing. So that was kind of the start of a rift between them. And then, of course, we ratify the Constitution. Of course, part of Jefferson's trade-off, or at least the section that he represented, was the Bill of Rights and the South being awarded the capital.
It's kind of like appease one part of the area to get the whole, you know, like especially like in presidential tickets, you know what I mean? Like,
yeah. To go along with that, you had the first election, George Washington winning handedly.
wait, who did you beat?
Technically, everybody ran. John Adams finished second in that election because we'll get to why that's important, because that'll be important here in a second.
Yeah.
So John Adams was the first vice president and basically a member and a leading figure of what became known as the Federalists. The Anti-Federalists kind of formed into what we would call the Democratic Republicans, who, for the sake of not having to say that word 50,000 times, I'm going to just refer to them as Republicans going forward.
Or DNR.
Or, yeah.
Like Guns N' Roses, GNR.
And it's funny that I say that because actually I just call them Democrats because they would just morph into what would eventually become the Democratic Party. So yeah, no, change that. I'm going to call them the Democrats going forward. John Adams became the vice president. Thomas Jefferson became the first Secretary of State. One of the big first fights of the Federalists and the Democrats was Alexander Hamilton, who was actually the real power player of the Federalist Party. He wanted to establish a bank. He wanted to collect all the debts of the former colonies and to establish credit for the new country. But a lot of the southern states, Virginia, for instance, had paid off their revolutionary debt. All right. George Washington serves 2 terms. Both times he wins unanimously. He's the only person to ever do it. Only one person would ever come close to it, and that would be James Monroe.
Our boy right there. What's up?
James Monroe.
Yeah. Fun fact, of the 5 first presidents, the only president you can't go see his homestead because it's still owned privately.
Wait, Monroe's house is still owned privately?
Yeah, it's still owned privately. Somebody still lives there.
So we can't just like knock on the door and be like, we know this is James Monroe's house. Can we like step in for a little bit?
Yeah, you can't.
You might see the Live, Laugh, Love poster on the side.
you can't do it because apparently people still live there. I was in D.C. last year and I went and saw Mount Vernon where Washington was. I saw Monticello where Jefferson is. I didn't go to Massachusetts, so I don't know the Adams homestead.
But I mean, you can play a serious game of football on the Monticello lawn.
Oh yeah, it's huge. It's fucking huge.
When I was on my DC trip in 8th grade, I was like, let's get a football game going. Like, this is like prime grass field.
All right, so obviously George Washington, as we know, steps down after 2 terms, and then we have the election of 1796, which pits John Adams versus Thomas Jefferson. John Adams wins barely. However, we start seeing that the parties have a factional. The Federalists seem to have the Northeast, and the South seems to be Democratic Republican.
A divide that definitely does not matter in the present day.
It doesn't matter one bit.
So Thomas Jefferson actually gets the second most electoral votes and becomes vice president because, and this is important, at the time, the electors, in the Founding Fathers' infinite wisdom, because they didn't thought parties at the time, they cast 2 votes, and so you pick your first place and your second place. It wasn't until the implication of the 12th Amendment in 1804 that you got, you're going to pass a single vote for the president and for the vice president to make sure this is, the party system, basically.
The ticket system?
Yeah, the ticket system. So Jefferson's the vice president. So you have vice president and the president from different parties, different warring factions. So John Adams, his presidency is highlighted by, several things I'm sure he would rather have left out of his biography. The XYZ affair, which starts a proxy war with, a quasi-war, I should say, with France, which was actually originally an attempt to buy the Louisiana territory. And then, of course, because of stuff like this, Adams starts getting hounded, and he passes the Alien and Sedition Acts, which kills whatever popularity he had left. It basically makes it illegal to... There's some immigration stuff in there, too, which, of course, is not really relevant to today's day and age.
No, not at all.
But the stuff that's mostly remembered are the Sedition Acts, which basically makes it illegal to criticize the government.
Well, it's like Bill of Rights. Oh, what's that now? So we just got this Constitution. Oh, totally forgot about that. No, he didn't.
Yeah, that was a good run, Bill of Rights. While you
it was a good run, right? It's a good. It had a good run. We're good.
So we get to the election of 1800, and it's a rematch. It is John Adams versus Thomas Jefferson. John Adams chooses a guy named Pickney. His first name escapes me at the moment, but he's irrelevant. He's a footnote in history.
That's just that Pickney. That just sounds like someone who's not going to be remembered like after their time.
He was chosen. He was from South Carolina. The idea was, as you start seeing it now, try to get some of those Southern votes because Pickney was popular in his region. So Thomas Jefferson picks a little-known politician, Aaron Burr. I'm being sarcastic. Aaron Burr is
my boy. Aaron Burr, my boy.
Aaron Burr is from New York, and New York is actually a swing in this election because it does end up in an area where it's around a bunch of states that are really Federalist. It also has Democratic, Republican leanings. So Jefferson's banking that the popularity of Aaron Burr can push him over the top.
Well, it's like we saw the inverse with John Adams trying to get someone from the
Yeah.
South. Jefferson's doing that with the North.
Yeah. And by the way, the reason why this is really considered one of like the modern election is they were vicious to each other. Jefferson was smart, and he also knew how to play the system, and he was also friends with a lot of people who ran newspapers. They would print so much crap about John Adams, calling him for his look, how he acts, how he's a monarchist.
He's not man enough.
He's not a man. He's not a real man. How the Federalists want to create a whole new monarchy, and that, like, really the stuff that really so pulls at people because we're not even 20 years removed from the Revolutionary War.
It's like the biggest talking point. Basically, the first two elections we say we don't want a king. We'd rather elect our leaders in power. But then it's like if you see sort of those things coming along, if the Federalists wanting to have a strong central government, I think they probably believe it would all coalesce to one figurehead, keeping everything in control. And there was a very legitimate suspicion of that monarchy even happening.
Yeah, that's why the Jeffersonians really pulled at the fear of a strong federal government because that's what they were playing at. Adams' party from his group, for whatever it's worth, were the first people to really post the idea that, hey, Jefferson is sleeping with his slaves.
Which was true, by the way.
The difference, of course, between the attacks was, of course, that what Jefferson was doing was actually 100% accurate.
So basically what you're telling me is even back then, Jefferson, being the states' rights guy, basically a libertarian, is also the one who's having like borderline unconsensual sex.
Basically.
Huh. Wow, some things really don't change.
So that's going on. They're just really vicious with each other. Adams accuses Jefferson of being an ungodly man, basically pulling at the fact that Jefferson is deist. Really making it about how Adams is a goodly man and Jefferson's not. What really kind of sets this apart from Adams and why he would end up losing, though, is Alexander Hamilton, who is a Federalist, but did not like John Adams. The problem is that John Adams was not a high Federalist. The Federalists were very strictly pro-England against France. Oh, it should be noted that Jefferson was accused of being too much in favor of the French Revolution. A Jefferson election would bring the French Revolution to the United States.
Sign me up, baby. What's up?
In what ways, though? Like, what would he do to bring about that?
They never really say. It's just that he wants that kind of revolution.
So it was like a buzzword sort of thing.
The Americans, they like to think that the revolution is like this big radical thing. It was the wealthy elites pushing away from the British monarchy because they weren't getting their way. That's basically what it ended up being.
Yeah, it was basically a branch off of power.
Whereas the French Revolution is a legit peasants' revolt.
Well, we can say that it started from the bourgeoisie, the Enlightenment ideals, proliferating that. Whole nother episode for that.
Yeah, but the Federalists were very pro-England. Alexander Hamilton modeled a lot of his stuff off of how British Parliament ran. Alexander Hamilton undercut John Adams in every way he could, even trying to get Pickney, the vice president, to be the person who got the most Federalist votes so that he would become the president and they could get rid of John Adams. Basically, Alexander Hamilton was so trusted by George Washington that he had a lot, as the first Secretary of the Treasury, he had a lot of influence in the government. A lot of stuff Hamilton pushed for got passed because he was so trusted by George Washington.
Well, George Washington's like the Jesus Christ of the United States, too. Like, are you going to go against George Washington in this part? Like, when you have that kind of power and prestige, like...
Yeah. Fun fact, The Federalists tried to draft George Washington to come back out of retirement and run against John Adams and take back the presidency. But before they had a chance to deliver that request, he had passed away. Passed
Brutal.
away in 1799 after riding out in the snow on his plantation and catching, not a cold, but of course at the time they bled him to try to relieve the pressure, and it just basically, they killed him.
Damn, he got owned, baby.
Hamilton was banking that he could get somebody in more of a position to dethrone Adams and take over the presidency. That's not how it happened, and unfortunately, because of all of this, because of the fact that the Federalists, of course, another trend that will come up a lot, could not coalesce around a single candidate, and because they were fighting with each other, the Democratic Republicans won. Thomas Jefferson won. Or did he? Here's where it gets interesting.
Whoa.
So the way it worked after the whole debacle of 1796 was that the parties would pick the electors still had the 2 votes. We hadn't passed the 12th amendment yet. The electors would pick their person, the first ballot, and then on the second ballot they'd pick their second candidate, the vice president. But then they'd take one of their elector votes and put it on somebody else just to make sure that one person got the right amount of electors. Well, somebody didn't do that, and actually, what's lost on me, and I actually discovered researching for this episode, John Adams finished 3rd place in this election.
Oh, shit.
Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr tied. They got the same amount. So, quick pop quiz. If a election ends in a tie, do you know what happens?
Racism contest.
It goes to the House of Representatives, isn't it?
Yes, it does. So this went to the House of Representatives. And even though the Democratic Republicans had won the House races and the Senate race, the Federalists were still in control before Election Day. So it was the Federalist, strictly anti-Jefferson people who get to choose the president. So they kept voting. They went through 35 ballots.
That sounds awful.
And they couldn't pick one until Alexander Hamilton stepped in. Alexander Hamilton felt like he could try to get more work done. He could get his agenda passed working with Thomas Jefferson.
So you're telling me he didn't vote for the other 34 ballots? Like he stepped in, like, all right,
well,
this is enough. That's to go in and stop something.
As the leader of the Federalists, he had a lot of influence, and he told them, "You vote for Jefferson. He's basically the lesser of two evils."
A concept that no longer has any relevance to the modern American political system.
And yeah, that pushed the scale. Jefferson won. He became the 3rd president of the United States. What ended up happening was this whole affair just put the final rift between Adams and Jefferson. Their friendship ended until much later when Adams and Jefferson started a correspondence with each other. They finally got to talk. They never saw each other again because John Adams retired to Massachusetts and Jefferson was in Virginia, but they kind of corresponded with each other. And in fact, they actually died on the same day, few hours apart, July 4th, 1826.
Wasn't one of their last words like...
Adams' last word was Jefferson still lives. Of course, Jefferson had actually died a few hours before. He just didn't know.
Man.
About as American as you can get. You could die Independence Day, be like, so the worst of political enemies, like, oh, we're just gonna die like patriots. It's July 4th.
An eagle just comes out of nowhere, soars across the sky.
So what can we say that's the significance of it all?
The first thing first is that this is, for better or for worse, the way elections would go going forward. Not so much the immediate elections, because basically this was the death knell of the Federalist Party. They never regained power. There's a side note to this, but I'll get to it after this, is that this is how modern elections would go. The biggest one being the elections of 1824 and 1828, where Jackson and his people and everybody else that he ran against just were slinging crazy mud at each other. And it's just how we see elections now. It's less about what you can do. The election wasn't even about positions and who had the best policy. It was about who was the better person.
It was very moralist. Like the president has to have a high moral standing
a
within
high
society.
moral standing. And that's basically the big takeaway from this election. It's also the election of 1800 is called the Revolution of 1800 because it was the first time in American history that power transferred from one party to another, and it was peaceful. And it was at that moment we realized that power can shift from party to party without bloodshed. So that's important too. It's also a transitional moment in American history because it was the start of the Jeffersonian period, and the next 30, 40 years would be dictated by Jeffersonian, because even Jacksonian democracy is just a branch of Jeffersonian, of course, not the same, but they are the same at the same time.
Yeah.
Almost how like you can say Trumpism is a branch of Reagan democracy.
Yeah.
Democracy.
In the
in
past,
quotes.
several presidential candidates have always been like sort of Reagan light or like staunch believer of Reagan policies, you know?
Basically, so that was the real hallmark of the whole thing. It's that it was our modern elections. How we see elections now is shaped by this election. And all you have to do is just like go on YouTube or just watch right now and see how elections are conducted. Yeah, we try to put some policy out there, but fuck policy.
Minus the not safe for work like YouTube video you showed us about the campaign ad.
Yeah, if Jefferson's elected, rape and incest will come across the land. It's supposed to be just crazy.
Just imagine like they buy like airspace on like Fox News or MSNBC, and then it's like Jefferson supports incest. And everyone's like, what? What is going? Like it's just total like it wouldn't fly in today's world.
It's also it's crazy to think about too, because these guys were friends, and you just power and ambition can just kill a friendship, and that's what it did. However, the country persevered, for better or for worse. Oh, as a parting shot, John Adams, before he left office, he appointed a bunch of last minute judges to positions, including Chief Justice John Marshall to the Supreme Court. So basically, he ensured like decades of Federalist courts.
I mean, if there's one thing that's survived to this time is that presidents can appoint judges. They can overhaul the system and be like, I'm going to put you here, going to put you here. John, I'm going to put you over in New York. Like, they stack the judges. Yeah.
Yeah, he basically ensured that there would always going to be a check to the Democrats' power, at least until a secondary party. And we didn't have another party rise up against what would become the Democrats until the Whigs. Of course, the Whigs were moderately successful, but the party that, of course, would eventually become the standard second party would, of course, be the Republicans, and they would start in 1856, but they wouldn't get any kind of success until 1860. But yeah, that's the election of 1800.
That's crazy. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I know John Quincy Adams was an abolitionist. Was John Adams also an abolitionist?
He was very anti-slavery. He stopped short of being an abolitionist, though. He did not agree with slavery. It's funny, too. If you read Jefferson's words, he also was concerned about slavery, but he also was unwilling to give up his power. And unfortunately, in the South, the amount of slaves you had was almost basically equivalent to how much money you had. Jefferson died poor, by the way. Not poor as in he still had his house, he still had all that stuff, but he died in debt because of bad decisions. Jefferson was a fail son. He grew up in the child of wealthy people, and he slowly over the time lost all of it.
America's favorite fail son. I can really relate when you say that.
You had it all and you blew it.
I like this election because I say this a lot to you guys. I say this to all my friends. Everybody likes to pretend like they don't like drama. The drama is like, oh, I'm above the fray, but you're full of shit. Everyone loves drama.
We inject that into our veins like every single. Oh, no drama, please! Like, we love it.
We love it, and this was just drama on an election scale, and it was great.
Political drama, like unheard of. It probably will never ever see again.
Now, this was colonial drama. If you want to hear some more modern drama, I'm going to turn it over to David Hollingsworth over here, who's going to talk about his election. Okay,
all
take
right,
it away,
baby.
David.
Let's go. All right, so I'm going to be talking about the 1972 election, which in a lot of ways is responsible for the modern both Democratic and Republican parties. But first, I got to give a little bit of background to kind of make sense of it. So, as we all know, in the 1930s, FDR just kept on winning and created the New Deal government. He expanded the power of the state. He raised taxes in order to pay for what we would basically call social democracy. So programs that are publicly funded that create a sort of infrastructure for the benefit of everyone. And there was a huge expansion of public schools, of infrastructure, of conservation programs, of fire departments, and of course also the creation of Social Security, pension funds for people in retirement that are publicly guaranteed to you when you turn 65. When FDR did this, he then created what was called the New Deal Coalition for the Democratic Party. This party took basically the working class and made them the main voting bloc for the Democratic Party. It is also what started to dislodge people of color, and especially African Americans, from the Republican Party. Because as we've heard a million times before, both in like introductory history classes, but also like conservatives on the internet who are like, oh, the libs won't tell you that Lincoln was a Republican and Democrats were the party of slavery, even though, again, like literally every intro to history class will actually explicitly tell you this. Yeah. But anyway, the Republican Party had traditionally held people of color, and especially like black voters, to their base. However, toward the end of the 1800s and beginning of the 1900s, they started abandoning civil rights and even programs that would benefit workers to increasingly become the party of business. Some Republicans were an exception, like Teddy Roosevelt, but for the most part, the Republicans started becoming a pro-industry party, and especially getting into the 1920s. Even though they still kind of tangentially held on to representing interest of people of color, they didn't really. When the New Deal coalition was being formed, people of color whose material interests, their economic interests, were being spoken to by the New Deal coalition, and whose interests as people of color were not really being acknowledged by the Republicans anymore, started forming in with the New Deal coalition, in addition to, the white working class. So basically you have this diverse working class forming the basis of the Democratic Party during the 1930s. And the Democratic Party, as a result, enjoys just unprecedented success. The big unions of the country, which had grown so much, especially during the Great Depression, are kind of the kingmakers of the Democratic Party. And so you have this New Deal coalition that stays in America for the next, 30 or so years. And so, for example, in the 1964 election between LBJ and super conservative Barry Goldwater, LBJ just wipes the floor with Barry Goldwater. It's not the most lopsided election in American history, but it is a very, very high margin through which LBJ wins. And he wins largely on his platform, one of invoking JFK's name, who after his assassination was like considered a hero, but also talking about his Great Society program and civil rights. And so 1964, you just have this resounding victory of liberalism. However, LBJ also supported the Vietnam War. And during his presidency, he increased the amount of troops in Vietnam by a huge amount. And so this creates a split within the Democratic Party over the issue of Vietnam. In addition to that, the civil rights movement, sometimes we view the civil rights movement, or we think of it as something that happened in one chunk and was largely the same ideologically. But in the sort of like late 50s, early 60s, the civil rights movement was mostly about formal desegregation. They wanted to integrate the places that were explicitly segregated, mostly in the South. A lot of Democrats, not all by any means, but a good amount of Democrats actually supported civil rights during that time. However, the later everyone got into the 1960s, the civil rights movement and other related movements such as the Chicano rights movement, women's movement, etc., became increasingly radical. Because of that, that started scaring a lot of people who were outside of those circles, including the Democrats who were, the sort of working class, and especially the white segment of the working class. They didn't feel comfortable with all this increasing radicalism. Because of that, the Democratic Party as a coalition was very shaken. And so in 1968, when LBJ decided that he wasn't going to run for re-election, there was divide over the issue of Vietnam and the divide over the increasing militancy of protesters, which a lot of the working class, and especially the white working class, saw as dangerous in the case of the radicals and entitled in the case of the student protesters who were protesting against Vietnam. In the 1968 election, there were different candidates that kind of represented these different fractions of the Democratic Party. Now, the one candidate who might have actually been able to sort of fix that fracture was RFK, Robert F. Kennedy. Unfortunately, he's assassinated in 1968, and so
We weren't ready for that.
not ready for that at all. Unfortunately, with his death came a further fracture in the Democratic Party. So there was a contested convention, and the person who actually ends up winning, Hubert Humphrey, was not one of the candidates in the primary.
Wait. So they basically went out of the primary to find a compromise candidate.
Exactly, yeah. And so Hubert Humphrey was extremely popular with the leaders of organized labor, who, again, were basically the kingmakers of the Democratic Party at this time.
Their base, basically.
Basically, yeah, and especially the AFL-CIO, which is a collection of America's biggest unions, right? The president of the AFL-CIO at the time, George Meany, was a huge Hubert Humphrey advocate. And so Hubert Humphrey, now when we talk about Hubert Humphrey, he was chosen by the Democratic establishment of his day, but he's not what we would consider, an establishment figure today. We would not call him that at all, because he had a 98.6 pro-labor voting record, according to AFL-CIO, and he was actually a fierce advocate of civil rights, but he was also very anti-communist, and he was for the Vietnam War. In the 1968 election between Nixon and Hubert Humphrey is literally only supported really by the Democratic Party as an institution and the AFL-CIO and other such unions that are like in that labor boss circle. So a lot of like young people, a lot of people of color, a lot of women are kind of turned off to Hubert Humphrey. And so he loses in 1968 and Nixon wins. And unfortunately, since then, people say, oh, well, Hubert Humphrey lost because, the left of the party wouldn't coalesce around behind him. That's not true, because again, it wasn't a matter of center versus left. It was more so like different interests and factions creating that fracture within the Democratic Party. Now, going into the 1972 election itself, with all this background in mind. In the 1968 Democratic primary, there were three main candidates. There were actually a lot more than that.
72 now?
Yes, 72 for the 1972 primary. And so you had George Wallace, the segregationist. You had Hubert Humphrey, who there was actually originally before Humphrey in the 72 primary, there was a different sort of establishment figure, but he just didn't really catch on at all, and so that's why Hubert Humphrey came back. And then there was George Mcgovern. Long story short, George Mcgovern actually ends up winning the primary contest, although it is super, super close, and actually there was a very good chance that George Wallace, the segregationist, could have come away with it, but he was shot, and he didn't die, but he had to eventually pull out of the primary.
Doesn't the shooting also kind of necessitate a small change in heart in him, too?
It does down the line, yeah.
I mean, it doesn't change all the other shit he did, but...
Yeah, exactly, yeah. Whether that was sincere or just so he could keep up with the times when segregation did eventually lose, it's up to speculation, but...
Segregation now, segregation later, segregation, like...
yeah, that was his stump speech.
Segregation before, segregation now, segregation in the future.
Yep.
That was Wallace. It's kind of crazy thinking how this kind of figure is still stuck around, but yet again, I think America has a very racial history that it's still kind of
trying to
reconcile with that idea, and it's just shown like Wallace to kind of last into the 70s. It was like, holy moly, like that's like,
yeah.
How does this guy not get pushed into the annals of history? No, he's still there. He's still
yeah. The racism did not go away. The segregationists in the 60s did not just fade
it wasn't
into the
like
background.
It wasn't like it's like a Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act. Poof, it's gone. No, it's
George Wallace. An interesting thing about his campaign style, as we were just talking about, he was a staunch segregationist, but he used a very anti-elitist rhetoric where he kind of adopts a lot of these talking points that you still hear today. He'll say, oh, the elite in Washington think you can't be trusted to send your own kids to school without also forcing colored children to be with them too. And those out-of-touch liberal elite in Washington and in the media are trying to control your lives. And so he frames it where it is the elite liberal state and its servants who are trying to control you and take away your freedom of choice to, in this case, be the segregationist, right? He gains an insane amount of traction, And there are even people who are interviewed at the time who say, I won't vote for Wallace because he's a segregationist and I'm opposed to that. But a lot of what he says otherwise makes sense to me. And Richard Nixon, being a very bright and pragmatic politician, kind of picks up on that. But we'll talk about that more in a second. So McGovern wins the primary. And a lot of the Democratic Party establishment at the time associates him with the anti-war movement and with the sort of rising new left and black radicalism and all that. And so they are very anti-George McGovern. And this is despite the fact that George McGovern actually had a pro-labor voting record of 93.5%. And this is according to CORE, which is the political arm of the AFL-CIO. So literally, according to the AFL-CIO, McGovern voted in labor's interests 93.5% of the time, which, to be fair, is not as high as Humphrey's 98.6, but for comparison, LBJ had a pro-labor score in the mid 60% range. And then Nixon was somewhere in the 20% range. And so McGovern was in no way an enemy of organized labor, but the way that they tried to paint him was that he was, going to let the radicals take over, and he was the candidate of the entitled student protesters. And so it was actually the Hubert Humphrey campaign that came up with the tagline, acid, abortion, and amnesty, that they stuck on McGovern. And that just meant he wasn't someone who represented the working class person. He was instead someone who represented
counterculture.
Exactly. And just to clarify, amnesty doesn't mean amnesty for immigrants like it would mean today. Amnesty meant amnesty for draft dodgers of the Vietnam War. So acid, abortion, and amnesty for draft dodgers was the three A's that were stuck with McGovern. And so McGovern had a really hard time overcoming that. But the AFL-CIO and all the other unions sort of in that orbit, except for the United Auto Workers and AFSCME, which are two of the kind of leftmost mainstream large unions in the country. Other than those two unions, and I believe one other one, the labor bosses who were generally led by people who were, socially conservative, anti-communist, pro-war, they undermined George McGovern's campaign. And so that brings us to the general election of 1972. Nixon had this concept for electoral politics and for the Republican Party to rebuild a majority that he kind of framed around his idea of the silent majority. What he wanted to do with the silent majority was appeal to suburbanites, but even just peel away the white working class from the Democratic Party. And the way he kind of envisioned doing this was getting to shift the conversation toward more cultural issues as opposed to economic issues, because the sort of common wisdom was that economic issues was the area where Democrats were strongest, and so the Republicans had to really take them on in the issue of culture. There is actually a quote that I have here that I'm just about to pull up where he explicitly lays this idea out.
Turn that Jeopardy music.
Yeah, seriously.
Okay.
Okay, thank you, Trebek. I found it. All right, so this is a direct quote from Nixon. The real issues of the election are the ones like patriotism, morality, religion, not the material issues, the president explained. If the issues were prices and taxes, they'd vote for McGovern. We've done things labor doesn't like. We've held down wages. But they'll support us for these other reasons. Nixon saw the campaign of George Wallace, and unlike a lot of other politicians, he realized that Wallace really was speaking to this sentiment of discontent against the so-called elites. Of course, a big part of that was a lot of white people who felt like efforts at desegregation were invading their own civil liberties, which is obviously silly. But Nixon took this sort of anti-elite rhetoric to appeal to the silent majority in his electoral strategy. Now, all that being said, though, about his decision to try to win on culture wars, he also wasn't afraid to run left on economic issues when he needed to. Going into the 1972 election, Nixon was popular not just because he had started trying to use that silent majority rhetoric, but he had created OSHA, he had created the EPA, he had expanded Social Security. And he had done just a number of other things that we would consider, liberal or progressive, not out of the goodness of his heart, but because he knew that in the shadow of the New Deal, he had to be able to run left when he needed to, or else he just wasn't going to be able to win any real elections. In fact, early in his electoral career in the 1950s, he had tried to run on a platform that was based in taking away labor protections, and he lost. It was during that time that he kind of realized, okay, like I live in this New Deal liberal order, and so I have to kind of appeal to that. And so he really brought that to the 1972 election. He also had de-escalated troop involvement in the Vietnam War, which by the time of the 72 election was a very unpopular war. He campaigned on the slogan "Peace with Honor," which basically meant the U.S. was going to win, but it was going to win from a position of honor and strength rather than apologizing for America the way that George McGovern would, according to Nixon. So he ended up, unfortunately, winning by a huge landslide in 1972 because, again, he was able to sort of activate the culture wars, which is, a big thing that is still a part of electoral politics even now, while also not being afraid to run to the left and become progressive on certain issues when he needed to. The way that this election is often misdiagnosed is as an election of progressive ideas not working well against a conservative campaign. However, in reality, it's more so a case of having Mcgovern, who was utterly abandoned by the Democratic establishment of his day and not even endorsed by the big labor unions, and then also having Richard Nixon, an extremely crafty politician who was able to actually run left when he needed to, as opposed to the old wisdom being, no one wants to vote for someone who's progressive. Nixon actually gained ground by becoming progressive when he needed to. Now, to be real clear before we move on to the next election, this is not to praise Nixon, because while he was, for example, scaling down U.S. involvement in Vietnam, he was bombing the shit out of Laos and Cambodia and causing just irreversible damage to those countries that they're still recovering from today. It was just that a lot of the worst parts of the Nixon administration were more under the radar, while he knew when to be better only when it would get him ahead in politics.
Also the Watergate scandal too.
Watergate
as well.
Yeah, you may have heard of this little thing called Watergate.
These plumbers.
Exactly, yeah. So, in addition to his terrible policies, like political policies, we also, of course, have Watergate, just revealing what a paranoid, power-hungry person that Nixon was, and not someone worthy of any celebration.
I mean, most of these presidents that we talk about are usually just in it for themselves rather than for a greater sort of good for the people.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, they're all Walter White at the end of the day, trying to make this idea that they're doing this for some greater good and stuff like that. But then when you really boil it down, you put them against the wall. No, it's for them.
Oh, yeah. It's performance.
They're spineless, and they're going to bend their principles to stay in power because they want that. It's like you're at the pinnacle of the free world. You are the president of the United States. Are you going to bend your back for people? As long as it keeps you in power, yeah, I will. But they're saving their skin, selling out who's the president supposed to support.
Exactly. And going off of that, Cameron, I really like that you said that. Because of that, going back to Nixon, we don't want to praise him, not just for the damage he did that wasn't as prominent before Watergate exposed him to be terrible, but also he peeled away a lot of people from that New Deal coalition. And so he set the stage for the eventual rightward turn of just all of American politics. So yeah, stuff like the EPA and OSHA and expanding Social Security are cool, but he wasn't doing those to reinforce the New Deal principles. He was doing those cynically in order to peel people away from that coalition, to tell people, oh, don't worry, you can vote Republican, they're not going to hurt your material interests. But really, he was doing that so then thereafter the New Deal coalition could be deconstructed, and then just right-wing hell capitalism can be allowed to reign over everything.
But just imagine New Deal Republicans.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
That's like an oxymoron in of itself. But I mean, if that's what Nixon wanted, that meant Nixon could keep himself in power. And yeah, I mean, of course, on the bright side of it, the EPA has actually been really good. And you see photos of Los Angeles in the 50s and 60s, and you can't even see the
it's like
skyline.
A different world.
Even the EPA comes in we see that it's actually clear.
Oh,
and
yeah.
so I mean, again, like those things are good. He didn't do it out of a genuine like I want to do this, because we see past elections he was voting on other things that were anti-worker and he got smashed.
Exactly.
And so it's just, all right, Dick, we got it. We know what you're doing. Like
That is one tricky dick, folks.
Do you ever think to yourself, the 72 elections up being one of the biggest political landslides in U.S. electoral politics, and then think about Watergate and like Nixon was going to win? It actually really gets to how paranoid of a person he really was when you think about it, because he was going to win. I can't remember. Does he have the largest win in the Electoral College? And I think one of the largest popular vote spreads of all time, doesn't he?
Yeah, I don't know exactly where it ranks, but it is amongst the top. Like, it is
right
one of the biggest
around,
landslides.
like right around Reagan and Mondale.
Yeah.
Like that was, I think Mondale only won Minnesota, I think.
Yeah, I think electorally it was, or in terms of the Electoral College, it was a little less one-sided. But yeah, in terms of the popular vote, I want to say it was comparable.
Yeah, I mean, Nixon doing Watergate is like Barry Bonds taking steroids. Like he didn't really need to take steroids. He was already like going to be a Hall of Famer, but then he's like, all right, let me see if I can get this in my system a little bit. And then, he goes on and breaks Hank Aaron's records of that. But he didn't need it. Like,
Exactly, yeah.
Like he was going to be a Hall of Famer without steroids.
Yeah, again, like going into the 72 election, he had scaled down Vietnam by the time the Vietnam War was unpopular. He went left on economic issues when he needed to, and he was winning the culture war.
Yeah, and then he just pulled that Watergate scandal, and then it's just like, you didn't need to do that.
Oh,
You
and
didn't need
just
to do it.
Just an extra fun fact about the election on top of everything that isn't the most thematically significant, but it does show how mental health issues have come a long way since 1972. So one of the PR problems that McGovern had, because McGovern was actually seen like a Bernie Sanders in the sense that one of his most praised qualities was being like consistent and having integrity. So he had pledged a vice presidential candidate whose name off the top of my head escapes me, but he had basically, chosen his vice presidential candidate. Then later it turns out that this vice presidential candidate had, I think, what we would now call depression, but I don't know if there was a term for it back then, but he basically had mental health issues, and he had checked himself into some sort of like weird barbaric clinic that did like electroshock therapy for, so-called like treating it, even though obviously that's nonsense. And so when that came to light, McGovern was like, oh, I'm not going to take him out as VP. I don't want to be mean to him. But he kind of said that expecting the guy to just withdraw, but he didn't. And so McGovern actually did dismiss him as his VP candidate. And it looked fucking terrible for him because, again, like his honesty was what he was really like known for. Like that was his best tool going into the election. And then he just kind of does that backdoor deal where he drops the VP candidate.
Yeah, I have it right here. In terms of the electoral vote, it was the highest ever separation between the two candidates until 84 when Reagan just wiped the floor with Mondale.
Damn.
And it is still the highest percentage of the popular vote a Republican has ever received. He got 60.7% of the popular vote.
Well, just imagine like if someone goes more progressive. Like we see that. We see progressive policies go in. Like look how badly Nixon smashed McGovern. Like if you say I'm not going to cut Social Security, I'm going to make the environment better. We're not going to smell sulfur every day of the week. Yeah, we see that. I mean, I don't want to allude to a certain election's about to happen, but
of course not.
But no, it's like we see Nixon pulling these progressive legislation, albeit not as in the like the goodness of his heart as as we want to think it, considering he put those things in place. But it's like, yeah, imagine putting progressive policies to help people. Look how many people showed up to the polls to vote for Nixon.
Exactly. And how many people didn't show up to vote for McGovern? Because a big part of why he lost in 72 wasn't even just that Nixon had so many people voting for him, but because a lot of the white working class element of the working class, because it should always be said the multi-racial working class is the most important driving force in politics, but the white portion of the working class was just sort of not enthusiastic because they still didn't really trust Nixon, and yet they still saw McGovern as the candidate of acid amnesty and abortion. And a lot of the white working class, rather than really being shifted toward Nixon, they're like, I don't really hate or love either guy, so I'm just not going to vote. And that was a big part of that.
Yeah. I mean, it just kind of goes to the point where it's just like, yeah, if you even give a sniff of progressive legislation, like it's always going to be on your side. If McGovern's not going to rebound from that or put like rebuttal with some stuff of his own, then yeah, it's just we saw what happened,
Exactly. Yeah, it is almost impressive how perfectly wrong people in the sort of academia op-ed think tank world have misdiagnosed 1972, because like you were just saying, running progressive in certain places helped him. So, thinking that we need people that represent just this super free market, hell world, free trade sort of approach to politics to placate the center, there's no real basis for that, and especially not in the 72 election.
Yeah, it's just like businesses lobbying in politics to defend the government so much. It's like, well, that's why free trade agreements, like it helps those who are lobbying for that. And with Nixon doing that, he won on progressive legislation. Watergate Scandal didn't need to do that. It shows that progressive legislation can win you an election. Like,
Exactly.
Regardless of where your heart is on the issue, even given a sniff of that, you are going to win.
Yep. And speaking of elections, Cameron, let's hear about the election of 1988.
Well, 1988 sort of set up how we see crime, how we see the foreign policy issues of our day form. So the two candidates, obviously George H.W. Bush, the Bush Sr., and then a Massachusetts governor by the name of Michael Dukakis.
A guy we all remember fondly.
So I'm going to go into the campaign trail. He ran on the Massachusetts Miracle. So unemployment, I think, in Massachusetts dropped double digits to where it was like 13% to 3%, I think. But it was a massive, severe drop in unemployment. So Michael Dukakis is strong. He's leading in the polls. People are thinking, oh, this guy might be president. Well, we do have a stance that he held, because there was the furlough program. People with life sentences were going to get weekend passes. I think Dukakis supported that. But there was a group that supported George Bush called Americans for Bush, but that were not part of his campaign. So the thing is, if what I'm going to talk about, if the Bush campaign put that ad out, they would have gotten grilled. But we see the Willie Horton ad.
Yes.
The Willie Horton ad saying he got one of those weekend passes and killed 2 people.
So this is Dukakis' fault.
They framed it as Dukakis' fault. Oh, he supports this,
The whole soft on crime talking point.
The whole soft on crime talking point. And so I think Dukakis' campaign manager said we could have rebounded from that, but it was, as we know, the Pauley Pavilion debate. The very first question that they threw at Dukakis, if your wife Kitty was killed by someone, would you advocate for the death penalty? He said no.
And do you want to explain how he responded in a little more detail, just for people not familiar with that story?
He said, I was against death penalty my whole life. You know that. He was doubling down in his position.
Makes him look weak.
It makes him look weak. The thing is, it's all about that Willie Horton ad. Because the Willie Horton ad in the Pauley Pavilion question, Bush was going to win. Because that Americans for Bush, they played into the fears of the American people. The Willie Horton ad was an ad put out by the Americans for Bush, which was an independent group that was not in associate with the Bush campaign. And that Willie Horton was someone who was in jail for first-degree murder. He was life in prison. But they had the furlough program, so people with life sentences got furlough passes so that it would promote better behavior in prison. But the thing is, Willie Horton went out of prison and killed 2 people. And so what the Americans of Bush did is they put that ad out because Dukakis was surging. It played into the American fears of crime. And we all know that there was racial overtones as well.
Of course.
Like, Americans were saying, oh, it's crime, people play into the fears of crime, but we all know what they were trying to push. It reinforced the idea of blacks being portrayed as criminals and white people really playing the stereotypes and stuff like that. And that's what tipped the scale for George Bush. And they still could have rebounded from that, but the Pauley Pavilion question, the very first question of the debate, that's what killed Dukakis' campaign.
Because it really does make him look soft on crime, and it makes it look like to the, scared white suburban electorate, oh, he's not going to protect us.
Well, yeah, and it's just like, if the Bush campaign itself would have put that ad out, they would have gotten killed.
Yeah, because an actual campaign couldn't run an ad like that.
No, they couldn't.
It messes with decorum. You can attack a person's policies, and you can imply that they would do something like not protect us in war or something like that. But you can't just outright say he's going to let the criminal element back on the street.
Well, it's kind of like the 1804 election, the mudslinging stuff. this could have been like a peak 1804, like
You mean 1800?
early 1800s mudslinging sort of thing. Like that's the illusion that probably go back to your election. But no, it's a regular campaign wouldn't have gotten away with that. In the Americans of Bush group, they played into the fears of the white suburban electorate. HW won the campaign. It set up what we see today.
Just a few years later, we would get the crime bill.
Yep.
I can make the argument that the Clintons officially moved the Democrats in the Republican light. They kept that tough on crime stance. Bush's son took that tough on crime stance. Even President Obama kept that tough on crime stance. He deported more illegal immigrants than any president combined. Bush, Obama, and Trump.
Yeah, Obama deported a record number of undocumented immigrants.
And then also we see like the explosion of private prisons. We see prison crowding.
Yeah, just real quick statistic on that, actually. When I was in undergrad in like 2013, the statistic we used to use was, as of around 2013, in the previous 25 years, there had been like 2 new public universities built, but over 20 prisons just in 25 years. So just an explosion, like you said, of incarceration.
Yeah, and we see like the 3 strikes laws. 3 strikes laws. We see, correct me if I'm wrong, most people in prison are nonviolent offenders, like people who had drugs. We see people in prison for petty, like nonsensical things like marijuana.
Yeah, so the overwhelming majority of people in prison are people there on nonviolent offenses, and one of the chief nonviolent offenses is nonviolent drug charges.
So we see this whole tough on crime thing stemming out of the 1988 presidential election. If you're tough on crime, you are more likely to be elected. And so all of this prison legislation, all this crime legislation gets passed. And as a result, now we see Black Lives Matter. We see so many of these groups come out that are fighting for good against the prison industrial complex in a
Absolutely.
sense. And then we just see, again, for our listeners, we went into Iraq once, Desert Storm in the late 80s. With Bush's campaign, we see all of these politicians like Wolfowitz, Rumsfeld, Cheney all come out of the late 80s. And this election was so catastrophic to society that we see the tough on crime and we see our crap foreign policy that has ruined our society, it's like no money for social programs are coming in. Our prison population's growing. Private prisons are a thing. And so we see all of this just plaguey sort of policies that are put in place since 88, and just like definitely was a pivotal election, even though HW was for one term because he said, read my lips, no new taxes.
And then
you got to pay
new
for
taxes.
You got to pay for Desert Storm, so taxes are being raised.
Yep. And just real quick correction there, Desert Storm was in 1990 to 1991.
So
Totally, yes.
So
under Bush senior, yeah.
terms. I mean, late 80s, early 90s. You can make an argument that 90, 91 is still like the late 80s, but
it's like the very end of the 80s.
It's practically the 80s still.
Tough on crime thing still plays. In 92, when Clinton was running, and he's still the governor of Arkansas, he once returned off the campaign trail to Arkansas to oversee the execution of a prisoner to show his tough on crime bona fides.
And wasn't he a black man with a mental illness?
I don't remember the exact terms, but yeah, there was something off about the person that they executed. Yeah, it had far-reaching implications. We're finally starting to see it turn. Kamala Harris was basically partially undone this election cycle because of her prosecutor record.
Yeah, it's like
ruined her.
And then like she kept somebody in prison because it's free labor for the state.
Yeah, and that's a big part of why the prison system does remain so overcrowded, even if explosion of the prison industrial complex in the 90s was obviously bad, but you could maybe give some people the small benefit of the doubt, even though it's still mostly insidious, because maybe they were scared, crime was going up, whatever, even though the way it went about was extremely racist and classist, but I digress. By now it is abundantly clear that this approach to handling crime is entirely inadequate. And yet it stays around because now there are so many vested interests from people who benefit from prison labor that companies that use prison labor literally lobby to keep non-violent drug offenses and other like petty crimes to have harsher penalties for those so that they may continue to draw from the pool of prison labor.
And also some of those records don't get expunged. And so it creates this recidivism. you're out of prison, but with your record, you can't find a job.
Exactly.
So you go back into prison. That also plays into the prison industrial complex. People going back into jail because their record cannot get them a job outside, or at least a good job to keep them out of prison. We're not practicing any form of deterrence. We'll let them out, but in the back of their minds, they're like, they'll be back.
Absolutely, yeah. And then even on top of the job thing, there's also like when you're applying for housing and when you're applying for other like services, felonies can be disbarring, or even if they're not, you have your record there.
And credit too.
Exactly. And so if someone's looking at your credit, maybe felons aren't barred, but you have a similar application to someone else, the difference of record of being previously incarcerated. And so it's so much harder to get like housing and a job that it becomes harder not to fall back into it, like you were saying.
And we see this as a result of this 1988.
Yep.
Because that was the whole tough on crime mantra. Presidents wanted to show they were tough on crime, get the confidence of the white suburban vote. We're seeing a significant pushback, like Black Lives Matter, seeing other groups that are speaking out against this BS.
Yeah, actually, going off of that real quick shout out to the, I forget the exact name of the organization, but it's a group of moms in Oakland who were recently occupying an empty house. They got arrested and kicked out, but they were able to, as a community, raise enough money to buy that house so that, people experiencing homelessness could have a place to stay within Oakland, which in a place where there's so much gentrification and rising house prices is super important.
Respect.
Big respect.
Big respect.
I think what we can take from all of our elections is that, first off, that they all built on each other.
Yes.
They went from, like you said, the first two elections were just coronations for George Washington. The first one without him was tough, but it was like, Jefferson and Adams had like conflicting differences, but they were still equals with each other, at least in their own minds. But by the time we got to 1800, the clear ideological split, and that was the end of friendships. That was the end of everything that they had fought for together in the Revolutionary time was gone, and it was about the vision for the country.
Yep. And then going to my election, 72, the late 60s and early 70s are a time of fracture in the Democratic Party where the old sort of socially conservative but pro-labor working class, and especially the white, which are the more powerful, unfortunately, elements of the working class were in charge. And their hold on the party was starting to fracture a bit. This could have resulted in a more inclusive, more diverse labor movement in Democratic Party had those at the top been more willing to accommodate. But because they pushed back so hard against the diversification of the working class and labor movement, that created a fissure that allowed, unfortunately, the concerns of big money and more of the suburban liberal population to weasel its way into controlling the Democratic Party.
We talk about Nixon putting in pro-environmental legislation. It swung drastically in 1988.
Yep.
Whereas more of like the hard line, tough on crime. I don't care if you're a Democrat or not. If you're not going to play into the fears of crime, you're not going to be president. We've seen a more like hard line, tough, rigid idea of like what it meant to be a president. If you weren't tough on crime, then you weren't going to be in the White House. And that has played disastrous in society, even just pushing for war as well. 1988 played into a lot of the problems that we see in society today. Of course, as historians, everything builds on one another.
Yep.
But if we're looking at like a specific time period, we can see this, and this. Neocon warhawks start showing up.
And like you said on that real quick, not even just the same school of thought, but some of the exact same ghouls from the Reagan and Bush senior administrations. These same people, individuals.
Yeah, they're still around.
Yep.
And they've been rehabilitated back into society just fine. They aren't facing any consequences for their actions.
Yeah, and especially with your guys' election, mine's kind of interesting because Jefferson's party would eventually morph into what we now know as the Democrats. Your guys' elections also start to show the slow decline of the Democratic Party. Like, of course, the Democrats would win elections, Clinton and Obama, for instance. But their elections, Clinton's elections was totally the final that the Democrats were not the New Deal Democrats anymore. And I know that they hadn't been for a while, but I know Mondale's generally considered the point where that kind of liberal Democrat was gone. But by the time we get to Clinton, could you really tell the difference between him and the Republican Party?
Because neoliberalism coalesced after the 1980s, and we saw, as a result of the Soviet Union, we see the Democrats, because the Republicans were playing like, oh, we're going to stop communism, America, French fries and burgers, like Russian Ladas, reliable, but who wants to buy a Lada? You can buy a Ford, buy a Ford. I mean, I digress. But
don't we all?
But no, it's just like they played into like, we're going to destroy the Soviet Union. In the 80s, we see the Democrats pushing Panning more and more into the right and going to like 92. Bill Clinton made the Democratic Party the Republican Light Party that day. And that when he got elected, because we saw the repealing of all of these protections,
and all these labor laws.
Glass-Steagall repealed. We see a lot of the problems that we put into place. The thing is, the Democrats, the old establishment Democrats, are basically Republicans. And
actually, real quick, based on what you said about Glass-Steagall, just for people who haven't heard of that bill before, those were a lot of the protections that were put against Wall Street and the financial sector to make sure, long story short, another Great Depression-style crash didn't happen. We took that away. What happened in 2008?
The crash. The Great Recession.
Yep.
People still have not seen a real recovery.
No, almost all of the recovery went to the top. And now we see it now with the Democrats again. They're at a crossroads. The Republicans know who they are. And
we hate them.
Yeah.
It's like, we know who they are. Like, it's mask off, we know who they are. But Democrats like, oh.
What are they going to be as a party?
It's a mixed bag. You don't know what's coming. But the thing is, we all know what's coming. They're Republican light now. Going back into like the late 80s, like the 1988 election, we saw the Democrats move into the Republican direction.
Dukakis tried to still run a relatively left campaign.
But he couldn't recover from that. Like, that was the point where everything just died. Like, nothing Dukakis would have done would have had him save face. It's just that was damage done.
And if I may, real quick, just to kind of close this out, if that's all right.
Yeah.
We're talking about the trends of the two main parties in the United States. There are a lot of questions about what the Democratic Party will be. Just also make sure everyone remembers that politics isn't just elections, and there are groups doing amazing work, such as the Oakland Moms I talked about, such as the resurgence of the labor movement. And of course, there is Bernie Sanders as a candidate who brings us back to the sort of New Deal way of looking at things that FDR did, although we can save that for another episode.
Yeah, we could do an entire episode just on the New Deal.
And we should.
And we should probably.
Yeah, we could do that. So we thank you for listening all the way.
Yeah, thank you for listening, everyone, and cheers, gentlemen.
Yeah. Well, we'll see you soon. Bye.
Bye.